What is happening, everyone? Welcome back to episode 26 of Manny's Food Channel. It's your boy Mansoor, aka Manny, and for today's episode I'm going to be making a very light, healthy, delicious Korean soup. So for today's menu I'm going to be making a Galbitang, which is a Korean short rib soup. Now in this recipe I kind of made my own variation of different kinds of ingredients and garnishes that I like. But it has some king oyster mushrooms, some tofu, a little bit of egg ribbons, some bok choy, and the broth that's extremely light and flavorful that brings it all together. So without further ado, let's get straight to it. So before we start any prep for this short rib soup, the first thing we're going to do, there's actually two steps. One is I have some short ribs here that I grabbed from my butcher. It's trimmed and it's cut into nice bite sizes. If you can't get them cut, the big ones are okay. But we're going to soak these in water to remove some of the blood from the bones. Make sure you submerge all the short ribs in water. And then we're going to toss this in the fridge for an hour. Next, I'm going to soak some dry shiitake mushrooms in warm water. These were just quickly rinsed, and I want to add this to the broth to intensify the flavor of the broth. So make sure you soak the shiitake mushrooms as well as the short ribs both first before you move on to the prep. And usually it takes about an hour for each of them to soak, but if you've got longer time, it'll be better. And eventually we're going to save this water and we're going to throw it into the short rib broth. So now we're going to start with the short rib stock. Here I have about 5 to 6 liters of cold water. You always want to start your stock in cold water and bring the meat up with the temperature all together. So if you can see here, in comparison to what it was before, now the short rib is a lot lighter in color, and you can see that a lot of the blood has been removed from the bone in the meat. So that way we can have a more pure flavor stock and flavor of short ribs as well. And it's a really good habit to get into, so that way we can remove any of the impurities that are in the meat. It looks like there's a lot of water here, but because we're going to be skimming it as it comes to a simmer to remove some of the impurities, we're going to be removing some of that water, and we'll probably by the end reduce it by about a quarter. So now I'm going to bring this up to a simmer, and we're going to skim the top of any impurities as it comes up before we add in the rest of the aromatics and the vegetables. So now I'm going to start by preparing all the aromatics and flavorings that I'm going to use to intensify the flavor of the beef broth. So first I'm going to slice off some onions. Next I'm just going to remove the roots and the top of the green onions. And this is about one full bunch here. I'm not going to slice it or anything because later we're going to remove it, but this is just going to help to intensify the flavor of the broth. Next I'm going to prepare the lemongrass. Now normally the lemongrass I get from my grocery store is pretty big, but these ones are gone a little bad, so I'm using 3 stalks of lemongrass, but ideally you want to use 1 to 2 big ones, and just trim off any of the bad parts and use the back of your knife, not the sharp part, the dull part here, and you're just going to indent the lemongrass to release some of that flavor so that it infuses nicely into the stock. And finally, I'm going to make something called sac d'épices, which is like a bag full of spices. It's something similar to it anyways. I have this here. This is one way of doing it, so that way when it's cooked you can just remove it from the stock or the broth. Another way of doing it is you can use a cheesecloth. Just put it in the cheesecloth and use a string to tie it up. But this way is a lot easier for me, so I'm going to do it this way. But before I put anything in there, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to slice the ginger, maybe into 4s, so it's a little bit smaller. I'm going to toss the ginger in. And then I have a bunch of garlic that I've peeled and I've just lightly crushed with my knife. I'm going to toss it in there. And then finally, to give a little more flavor to the stock that we're going to be making, I'm just going to toss in some peppercorns. This is optional. I'm just tossing in around 15 to 20 peppercorns. And now I'm just going to close this up and we're ready to toss everything inside our broth and our stock as well. So now the stock has come to a light simmer. Just grab a metal spoon or a ladle and start skimming off all these impurities at the top. And I'm probably going to be doing this for around 20 minutes or so, just to make sure that I remove as much impurities as possible before we continue to make the stock. So don't worry about the lost liquid that we're removing as we're skimming off these impurities. That's why we added in extra water to account for that lost amount of water that we are removing. And sometimes I use the word stock and broth interchangeably. The main difference between the two is that a stock is not seasoned and a broth is. So usually a broth contains all your aromatic, your spices, any of the seasoning that you have or that you want to use right before you're about to eat it. Whereas a stock is what this is here, where we're just infusing some flavors into it so that we have more intensified flavor before we prepare the broth. Now before I add in all the veg, I'm going to strain the stock because there's still a little bit of impurities that are kind of floating around in there. And ideally you would usually strain the stock after everything has been cooked before you season it to make the broth. But I'm going to do it now because I want the onions to be part of the garnish for the soup. So I'm just going to remove the beef bones here, or the short ribs, and I'm going to strain the stock quickly. And then we're going to add the veg and the short ribs back to the stock and let it infuse and cook. Now we're going to bring the stock together. I'm going to throw in the broth. Next I'm going to throw in the shiitake mushrooms. And I'm also going to throw in the water that we soaked the shiitake mushrooms in. And finally I'm going to throw in the lemongrass, the green onions, the onions, and my little Sake piece. So now I'm going to bring this stock up to a simmer and let it cook uncovered for around an hour and a half to 2 hours, or until the short rib is fully cooked and tender. In the meantime, we're going to move on to preparing the rest of the ingredients and garnishes that are either going to go inside the broth or going to be garnished on top of the soup. So now I'm just going to let this simmer and we'll move on to preparing the rest of the ingredients. So for the garnish, there's a lot of different varieties that you could use, but these garnishes are kind of my favorite. So one of them is firm tofu. Now I'm going to cut them to around ½ inch thick, really nice thick slices, and what we're going to do is we're just going to color it by frying it off until it's golden brown, and we're going to season it with a little bit of salt. So I'm just going to cut up this tofu here. Next I'm going to cut up some moo radish to around the same thickness as I cut the tofu. Next I have a king mushroom, and I'm just gonna cut off the roots. Now I know I cut a little more than the root here. I'm not gonna throw this away. I'm still gonna use it, but just for presentation purposes and the size of my bowl, I just want it to have a nice shape and length. So all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut this in half, and I'm just gonna give it a nice little score so that when we fry this off to golden brown, it has a nice look and presentation to the mushrooms. So I'm just going to give this a light score. Next, I'm going to separate 3 egg yolks from the egg whites, so that way we can do nice egg ribbons. That acts as a nice color and garnish for the short rib soup. Now I'm going to season the egg yolks with just a little bit of salt and give it a nice whisk. So this short rib soup is a bit on the milder side. There isn't really any spice to kind of give it a bit of a kick. So I'm gonna make a bit of chili paste. It's, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, it's called yang nam sauce. So all it is, it has a little bit of gochugaru, which is Korean chili powder. If you don't have Korean chili powder, you can use cayenne as a substitute. I have some very finely cut green onions, grated garlic, and to give it a bit of that saltiness and bring it all together, I'm going to add a little bit of soy sauce. Now you don't need to add a lot of soy sauce, just enough to kind of bind it all together. And I'm just going to give this a nice mix. Next I have some bok choy, and I'm just going to remove a little bit of the root. All you have to do is blanch these for around 3 to 4 minutes in the stock for it to be ready. You don't want to overboil it so it becomes really soggy. You still want a little bit of the texture from the bok choy. So just cut off the roots. And finally, just for an added color and touch, I'm going to add a little bit of thinly sliced green onions. Just remove the roots and just slice the green onions really fine and very thin. Now to prepare the tofu garnish, that's what we're going to start off with. I'm going to toss in some canola oil, just enough to coat the bottom of the pan. And next up, I'm going to throw in the tofu, and I season this side with salt, and I'm going to flip it over to fry it off. Then I'm going to season the other side with salt as well. So once both sides are golden brown, you're just going to remove it from the pan and put it on a plate with some paper towels so that way you can remove some of that excess oil and excess fat. And continue to do this step until you fry off all your tofu. And then next up, we're going to do the mushrooms. So next up, once you've fried off all your tofu, I switch the pans here. So that way I have a fresh pan. I don't have any of those little bits and pieces that I use in the previous pan. And I'm going to quickly add color to the king mushrooms. And we're going to put our scored side down first. And make sure your pan is fully hot before you add it in, so that way you add a nice golden brown color. And once it's golden brown on this side, then we'll flip it to the other side and cook it quickly. And in the same pan, we'll cook off the eggs. So once both sides are nicely cooked, and it's nice and golden brown all the way around, and you can see those nice score marks on the inside of the king oyster mushrooms. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to put it on a plate with paper towel, just like we did with the tofu. And I turn the heat off because there's a lot of heat in the pan. I don't need any more heat. And now what I'm going to do, if the pan's too hot, remove it off heat, let it cool down a little bit. But I'm now going to toss in the same pan the eggs and cook it on the residual heat until it's fully cooked. Evenly spread it out amongst your pan, and then we'll cut nice looking ribbons with this egg yolk. So the stock has been simmering for around an hour and a half, and the meat is tender, fully cooked. So now I'm going to prepare the broth. First I'm going to remove the lemongrass, any of the green onions, and if I can find it somewhere in here, the sake piece, this guy here. And next up, I'm going to toss in the radish and cook this for around 20 minutes or until it's fully cooked. Next, I'm going to season the broth. I'm going to toss in around a quarter to half a cup of soy sauce. It just depends on how much stock or how much broth you have. You want to make sure that you don't want to over season the broth. And in equal parts of the soy sauce, I'm also going to add in some fish sauce as well. If you're allergic to seafood or you don't like fish sauce, you can omit this step, and if you need more salt, you can either add more soy sauce or salt as well. And then we're going to continue to cook this for around half an hour until the radish is cooked, and we'll cook off the noodles, blanch the bok choy, and we can start plating. Just a funny, quick little story. 2 years ago, one of my chef instructors, who is now my mentor, gave me a pair of chopsticks, which are these ones, and also another red ones that are similar to these. And the one thing she told me was to make sure that they don't sit in my cabinet to collect dust, just like any other dishes that I don't use. And 2 years later, finally I have a reason to use these chopsticks, and it's to dig into this delicious bowl of short rib soup. So chef, if you're watching this video 2 years later, I'm finally deciding to use these chopsticks. So without further ado, time for the taste test. Cheers. The soup is extremely delicious, very light. And the best part about it is that it's extremely healthy. You can put your own variation and twist on it. You can add different kinds of vegetables, different kind of protein, but the end result is always going to be delicious. So I really hope you did enjoy this video, and if you did enjoy this video, please give my video a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I look forward to seeing everybody next time.